Hey guys, it's me, EODGamer here, and we're back with another character team composition video. And you guys really liked the Zealer one that I've done previously and really requested for this one as well. So I really put in effort to push this out as soon as I can to get this critical information to you as well. Unlike Zealer and a lot of other characters on this list, actually, Jingyuan is actually not a very straightforward character to build. His kit revolves around Lightning Lord passive, which he wants to build stacks for the Lightning Lord in order to dish out damage outside of his turn order. Now, one thing to note is the Lightning Lord takes off all of his base stats and stats as well, except his speed stat, which means that speed buffers, for example like Bronya and as well as Esta, doesn't really buff the Lightning Lord directly in terms of the speed. A lot of people have the misconception that in order to maximize Jingyuan's damage, they are focusing a lot on Lightning Lord and building the maximum amount of stacks. But if you do the mathematics and you count, the maximum amount of damage that the Lightning Lord can do is 660%, which is 66% per stack, maximum 10 stacks, so 66 times 10. And if you look at just Jingyuan using his normal attack or his skill and using his ultimate, he already dishes out like 300% attack multiplier, which means that Jingyuan actually approximates 50% of the overall damage compared to the Lightning Lord and how much they do. What this means is your team composition shouldn't be taking into account only Lightning Lord in mind, but having a diversified comp such that you focus both on Jingyuan himself as well as Lightning Lord. Now, in terms of free-to-play options, I'm talking about no gacha, 4 stars, and purely with the starter characters. I think the first thing that Jingyuan will need is a buffer type unit. Of course, other buffers will work, but considering that you are relatively a free-to-play character, you have no choice but to go with a character like Esta. Although her speed up doesn't directly benefit Lightning Lord, speeding up the entire team boosts the whole team's damage, and the faster that Jingyuan goes means he's able to build up more stacks, get more energy restoration, which will indirectly lead to buffing the Lightning Lord as well. Not the ideal choice, but for a free-to-play comp, Esta works pretty well already as well. One thing to note is Jingyuan likes to use his skill more so than his normal attack, which eats up skill gauges, and Esta does drink quite a bit of skill gauges already, so some things to consider. In terms of the pivot slot, I'll be looking for a character that is more defensive in options, and I think the real choice that you have is between, for example, Fire MC, or perhaps you want to go for Natasha. I think both options work pretty well. One thing to know is he's relatively squishy than most tankier DPS of the Destruction class. In terms of my preference, I prefer Fire MC just because of the synergies together with Esta for a totally free-to-play comp. But I see no downside in using Natasha as well for the emergency panic button heal, which works really well too. And of course, the gap fill, very quickly I'll just put in Dan Heng as well for more of a single target damage as well. And I think one thing that I want to talk about now is the ability that Dan Heng has, and that is speed down, which eventually will lead into a character like Welt, which I'll be talking about later on. So one thing to note, why speed down is very important for Jingyuan is because when you speed down the enemy, you are indirectly or in a sense buffing both your entire team's speed and also Lightning Lord speed. And note that Lightning Lord doesn't get speed buffs from characters like Esta who buffs Jingyuan. The Lightning Lord indirectly gets speed buff when the enemy moves slower, and that is why speed down is very important. You're not aiming to hit all 10 stacks on the enemy all the time, but you're trying to increase the amount of damage that is being done. And here's a very important point that I want you to listen real quick. The Lightning Lord's damage scales almost linearly, which means if you have 6 stacks, it's 6 times 66. You have 10 stacks, it's 10 times 66. What that means is you shouldn't discriminate between 6 stacks or 10 stacks. If you think that the more stacks you get, the better, it's not the case. It's only true if it's scaling quadratically, where the more stacks you get increasingly more benefit. And here's another reason why you shouldn't aim for 10 stacks. If the Lightning Lord is able to act and he uses all of his, let's say, 6 stacks, he automatically gains itself, the Lightning Lord, 1 stack for himself, because it doesn't restart at 0, it restarts at 1, which means the more times Lightning Lord acts, the more stacks you are actually gaining as a whole, which increases your overall damage. This is why it's incorrect to focus too much on the Lightning Lord, and instead you want to focus on maximizing the action turns taken on both Jingyuan as well as the Lightning Lord. And that's why speed down is really key. And this team is strong because it gives you speed buff for the base Jingyuan, and as well as speed down the enemy while providing you defensive options as well. This is a really strong team, but a lot of your damage will come from Jingyuan. Okay, so that is for the total free-to-play comp, and if any of you are confused by like his skills and all the other characters I mentioned, do check out hsrguide.com. I wrote every single character in terms of like their stats one by one. So now let's talk about changing up this comp in terms of if I had Gacha 4 stars. And the most important thing that I would change is definitely taking out S-Star and replacing it with Jingyuan. Jingyuan I think is really strong and possibly is the strongest character for Jingyuan, even stronger than Bronya. And the reason why I think so is because Jingyuan gives him exactly what he needs, which is energy restoration and attack buff. The attack stat is actually shared between Lightning Lord and himself. Energy restoration gives him more of his ability to use his ultimate, and his ultimate gives him 3 stacks for Lightning Lord. So the more you use his ultimate, the more efficient and the more damage you do as well in totality. She can also be built as like a semi-pseudo damage dealer as well if you want to add in quite a bit of damage on the side. So I think that Jingyuan is definitely going to be the most synergetic character out of almost every single Harmony character or most characters in the game for Jingyuan, and that is something to consider as well. She doesn't buff speed at all, and I think that is fine because Jingyuan doesn't really need that speed stat and wants to stack as much attack to get the overall damage in the team. So now that we have this character, Jingyuan in here, I think the other 2 slots are relatively flexible. This is probably the biggest and most important change. These 2 are so synergetic together. But in terms of the defensive slot, I guess your options in terms of this slot is not really very versatile. I won't really even like put Mark 7s inside as she doesn't really offer what the team needs. You want like overall shielding or overall healing will be much better. So I'll leave this slot as it is. And your other options for your single target DPS in terms of 4-star will definitely be a character like Susang. Of course, you can play Hook here, but note that Hook is very slow and very reliant on like speed buffs as well, which Jingyuan doesn't provide. So if you are running S-Star instead, you could consider running Hook here for a single target DPS, well, in a form like S-Star plus Hook. But if you are running Jingyuan, you want to play more of Danheng as well as Susang in your this slot. One other option you have, for example, if you're not lucky to get Jingyuan, or perhaps you're already running S-Star on the other side, I think Pella is a really solid option with that AoE defense break to combo with an AoE DPS as well. Of course, the downside of this is you don't give as much buffs, or rather you don't give your speed buffs to the rest of the party, for example with S-Star's buff, and he doesn't get as much energy restoration from Jingyuan. You might lose a little bit of damage from this slot, but overall I think it's fine as well. So those are some things to consider. Now let's go in with a standard 5-star. What if you got a standard 5-star and you want to know like which is the best in case you are like re-rolling your account and preparing for Jingyuan as well. We'll be doing a re-rolling guide also, so definitely check back on the channel. And don't worry about all these characters and like what team comps and stuff. I'll be doing videos on almost all 5 stars as the time goes on. Just let me know in the comments below which one you're interested to see first, and I'll prioritize those as well. You guys requested for Jingyuan and I definitely put in effort to prioritize him as well. So okay, so let's talk about first the simplest one, right? The worst 5-star, standard 5-star to get that is totally not synergetic with Jingyuan, and that will be a character like Himiko. Why do I say it's not that she's a bad character, but she doubled down on AoE damage, and most of the time you'll find that his main issue is not damage. He has tons of it and you don't really need an additional AoE DPS. Of course, if you want to play this team in terms of Himiko as well as Jingyuan, the option that you have definitely is to go for S-Star, because S-Star gives fire damage bonus and speed bonus. You can run a triple fire like S-Star, Fire MC and Himiko will work really well, but you will have to note that your single target damage is going to be a bit lacking in that aspect. Hey, so other than Himiko, let's talk about the next 5-star character. Let's just go with the closest proximity, and I think that Yanqing will be a really good option for a hunt slot because it doesn't require you to have a character like Danheng or doesn't have to have a character like Susang. You can increase the output of damage you do early on. As you know, Yanqing is relatively independent in a sense where he has a lot of crit buffs for himself with almost like 100% crit rate at the early game. Makes up a lot for in terms of Jingyuan. He takes a bit more time to scale as he needs more gear and stuff like that, artifacts to make him much stronger. Fire MC will be my go-to choice because the shielding will prevent the damage taken for Yanqing, which allows him to keep up his passive as well. But overall, I do think that these two are like pretty much interchangeable, Natasha and Fire MC. In terms of the slot 2, in terms of the attack buffer, I still think that S-Star will be better if you are focusing on 2 DPSs. If you are focusing on a hyper carry, of course Jingyuan is going to be better. So in the sense, these two are options. Of course Bronya works really well as well. So of course, if you're running Bronya in this slot, you wouldn't want to play a character like Asta or Jingyuan already. It's going to be doubling down on too much attack buffs. And in terms of this composition, you are really playing more of a hyper carry Jingyuan role. And to make use of Bronya's full kit better, you want to have some at least damage dealers coming from the 4th slot. And I do think that either Dan Heng or Susang would stay in this formation. I want to still go more with Fire MC because Fire MC does offer a little bit more damage compared to Natasha, who if let's say you play like this, right, she doesn't offer much wind break, she doesn't offer much physical break, and you are relying on either Dan Heng or Susang to be like your other elemental break damage. With Fire MC, at least you get a little bit of fire breaking to make out your flexibility options as well. I think that she will work really fine, but Jingyuan probably will offer a lot more in terms of the cost, the efficiency in terms of value for money, so that you can get another 5-star character, which I think is going to be really strong. So if you have a character like Clara, so one thing to note is that Clara is also a AoE DPS character in nature, and probably is not going to be very synergetic with Jingyuan because they are both going to be more AoE focused. What you really want is more like a single target damage. And if you pull Clara and you want to play Clara with Jingyuan, so you have a very good flexibility on choosing who you want to buff, as both of them have very high base attack. But then again, if you are running 2 strong damage dealers, you might want to consider running Asta in this slot over here. And the last slot you want to have, you could either run a healer like Natasha in this slot to fill up the gaps of sustain, or you want to run a physical or rather a single target DPS. As you can see with these 3 in the first 3 slots, you are missing quite a bit in the 4th slot. That's why your gap fill is so varied depending on what your team composition needs. Can still be done, but you have to choose wisely in terms of your last slot as well. So with Gepard in this set, your defensive option is more or less checked, and you have pretty good AoE shielding as well. So what this means is you can afford to take out a defensive character like Natasha here. You can pull her out and play in a more offensive set that you see over here. I think Gepard is a pretty stable character. He's not going to be too fantastic in terms of performance, but he definitely solidifies a lot of your early game. One thing to note is that Gepard is going to be the best in slot for a speed runner, because healing and defensive options only matter if you're fighting content that is way too hard for your level. And for speed runners who are aiming to clear the game, like for myself, as quickly as you can, Gepard is going to be a very, very efficient option, and it's probably the secret to speed runners, especially very early on. But let's just keep it between ourselves for now. Okay, so the next 5-star character that we have is Bailu. So with Bailu here, you can actually afford to go a little bit more all-out offensive. What do I mean by that? Because you have a bit of revive and AoE sustain from Bailu. So what this means is you can afford to really go full out. You can even run like a triple DPS if you wanted to, but Jingyuan here will make up more in a sense, because she's also like a pseudo DPS, sub DPS kind of thing. So I would actually take Asta out, run Jingyuan together with Bailu, as well as maybe Dan Heng or Susang, depending on which character you prefer more. Both of them work really well. Speed down works also excellent, but she's also pretty independent as well, so that you can just dedicate your buffing for Jingyuan onto Jingyuan and let her do whatever she wants. So Well is going to be the best for a few reasons. Mainly is because of its AoE speed down that he gives. As you know, we talked about it previously, that speed down is valuable because when you have an AoE speed down on your enemies, it means that your whole team is acting more often. When your whole team is acting more often, you cannot think of it like focus myopically at the damage Lightning Lord is dishing out and the stacks that he... Oh, my Lightning Lord dishes out before he hits the 10 stacks. No, it doesn't work that way. You must see it from a total team dynamic point of view and the total damage that your team is outputting. When you reduce the enemy speed in totality across the board, means that your team is effectively doing much more damage than they would have been. This will be very important in battles that require a DPS check, especially if you need to hit certain DPS milestone before enemies take a certain number of turns. So I think Welt is the best standard 5-star to get for Jingyuan, especially because Jingyuan is also really strong as well. And in terms of the 3rd slot, here's where it gets a bit tough to choose, because if you have a AoE, another AoE damaged or debuffer, and you already have a dedicated attack buffer here, you want generally a more defensive option for your 3rd slot. But if you put in a more defensive option for your 3rd slot, you're going to be missing out on single target DPS. So here's where it gets a little bit complex, but bear with me. You will have to either play, you have to see your team composition, what you're up against. If you can burst down the enemy before they even take a single turn, in that case when you run, for example, Welt, you run Jingyuan and you run Jingyuan here, and they are able to burst down enemies very quickly because they are all not so tanky in terms of mob, then you don't really need a single target DPS. And in this case, you might even consider running Esta, like a triple I would call it a hyper carry team, where you run Esta to buff your team's speed, you run Welt to lower the enemy team's speed, you run attack buffers, on top of that another attack buffer to make it a really strong hyper carry team as well. And Jingyuan scales off with the attack of Jing Yuan as well. So this team will be a very niche comp, and it's, I would say, a much higher level difficulty because you really need to know what you're doing. If you are an advanced player in turn-based games, I would highly recommend you playing a double support into Jingyuan together with Welt. This team is going to be insane, especially if you can defeat the enemies before you take too much damage as well. You can steamroll a lot of content. But of course, if you're not willing to play so much thoughts and thinking about your team comp, running two defensive options, choosing between these two, either one really works fine. I think Natasha might age out in this option because it gives you a team-wide healing, as all three of them are pretty important as well, and it just keeps up the momentum. And alright, now let's go into the whale team comp. And I think a character that works really well with Jingyuan actually is the first banner character, Zealer. Hoyoverse definitely know what they were doing when they were planning the banners. They put one single target DPS and one AoE target DPS so that you have a very strong team comp here. Even though they are both hyper carries in nature, this allows you to run, for example, a character like Esta to buff both of them up to dish out damage. Or you could even run Jingyuan to decide if your stage requires more single target buffing, you can choose her instead, and if you need more AoE damage, you can choose Jingyuan. And then the last slot is definitely going to be a more defensive option, like for example you can run Natasha and Fire MC. Basically you can see that Jingyuan is going to rely a lot on these two characters as a solid core. This is going to be a pretty stable comp, especially because you can later on in the Memory of Chaos bring Zealer down, and you can have two totally separate teams which does a lot of damage as well. If you are perhaps planning to play like a team husbando team that you want to have Lota in the mix as well, I think that Lota is going to be really strong, especially if you can replace Fire MC as well as Natasha. You can put him in this slot, and maybe you can run, for example, if you're planning to play Yanqing, a standard Fire Star, or perhaps you're planning to play Dan Heng, if you want a team husbando team. And your attack buffer, unfortunately, I will recommend you stay with a solid attack buffer. I think that this is probably a very strong team to run as well. With AoE dispels the enemy, and healing in terms of more offensive healing for Lota, and an emergency heal with his elemental, with his skill as well. Doesn't only work very well with Blade, can also work pretty well with Jingyuan as well. And in my opinion, this is going to be probably, my guess would be one of his most solid teams that Jingyuan can play. And the reason for this is because you get a very strong attack buffer and energy restorations in Jingyuan. These two are actually offensive supports. Lota, out of the three healers, is the one that is the most offensive in terms of healing plus a bit of damage. Welt does very good amounts of damage off as well, and slows the entire team down too. So very, very strong options that you have, and in a sense, his healing is more offensive, but if you attack any of your characters, they have like this lifesteal embedded, so all of them will do well with the healing, with that offensive ability that they have. Very strong team, very good damage potential. The only choice that you have is maybe you want to play Esta instead of Jingyuan. But overall, I do think that, in my personal opinion, if I was a Jingyuan main, this will be the team that I'm aiming for, and I'll possibly build towards. Very strong team composition for all the reasons we mentioned previously. And do like and subscribe if you want to see more of such content. Let me know which other character you want to see next, or perhaps you want to see my tier list video on all the characters we have already done. Thank you so much for watching, and see you in the next video.